This lecture is part of the History 363 Modern Africa class at Flagler College. I'm Dr. Young, the instructor. Today we're going to be discussing the relationship between Europe and Africa in the 19th century, talking in particular about the roles of missionaries and explorers. Sometimes missionaries and explorers were one and the same thing, and all of this is in preparation for our next lecture, in which we'll talk about the so-called scramble for Africa, Europe's seizure not only conceptually but also physically of most of Africa to create the colonial period. So this is the backstory really on European-African interaction, and extending that story up through about the 1880s. But Europe and Africa had long had interaction with each other. In fact, going all the way back to antiquity, we find lots of evidence of people in Europe, Greeks and Romans, later medieval Europeans, interacting in various ways with Africa and with Africans. North Africa had been part of the Mediterranean world, of course, and the Romans had extended their hegemony over North Africa. In fact, it had been a terribly important province, or a set of provinces in North Africa, Egypt, and the parts of Africa that are now occupied by the countries of Algeria and Tunisia, and places like that were very, very important possessions of the Romans. And even after the Muslim conquest, there was a great deal of interaction between Europeans and Africans. And what's interesting about this, and I think there's a lot of good ongoing research, some of my own research has delved into this a little bit, this research on European understanding of Africans. Of course, there was tension between European Christians and North African Muslims due to the Crusades, but there are also a lot of pieces of evidence that show that European depictions of Africans, whether we're talking about North African Muslims or sub-Saharan black Africans, were not marked by the kinds of racial notions that we find more into the modern era. That racism, the sense of race, was in fact largely a product of the transatlantic slave trade, in other words, of the 17th and 18th centuries. And we're going to talk a little bit about the development of those notions over the course of this lecture. Previous to this time, though, it should be noted that Europeans considered Africans to be inhabitants of a continent that had things that recommended it in its own right. We find, for instance, depictions of the rulers of Mali in the late Middle Ages as European-style monarchs with great wealth. There was a great deal of respect accorded, or at least awe accorded to Muslim rulers who held a great deal of wealth and power in the Middle Ages, and the Crusades seem to, in some cases, have engendered some amount of respect, even if there was a great deal of animosity at the same time. And so these more modern developments of the concept of racism, although they may have antecedents in the ancient and medieval worlds, really are modern developments, and there is a much longer history of interaction that we should be aware of between Europeans and Africans. Starting in the 18th century, we find Europeans engaged to an intimate degree, to a great degree, on projects associated with Africa. And much of this comes out of the abolitionist movement. We've talked already about abolitionism noting, for instance, that the abolitionists did not necessarily hold positive ideas about Africans in their mind, that even for abolitionists who wanted to get rid of the slave trade and wanted to stop the traffic in human cargo, Africans were inherently inferior beings who, as these thoughts continued to develop, there also came along the notion that Africans were backward and were inherently kind of lost without European help, that it was the responsibility, in fact, of Europeans to bring to Africa the kind of development that Europe had enjoyed. And this was a very sort of paternalistic line of thinking, that Europeans saw it as their responsibility to shepherd Africans in this manner. And so, we find these ideas about European superiority and African inferiority coming out in European discussions about legitimate commerce. Europeans viewed it as their responsibility to bring Africa into a situation where it would traffic in legitimate commerce, and this is, we've talked about this in previous lectures, and I don't want to belabor the point here. But that was very much a public discussion that Europeans were having, and the whole notion of legitimate commerce came out of that public discussion. Starting in the 18th century, Europeans also developed vis-a-vis Africa. It had the same notion, I think, relative to the Americas and parts of Asia in previous centuries, but very much an idea that Africa was a place to be explored for multiple purposes. For the purpose of, again, this paternalistic desire to aid Africans, but also because Africa excited no end of fascination in the European mind. It was this strange and dark, mysterious place, inherently full of all sorts of dangers and the sorts of things that would get an adventurous mind excited. If you have encountered at any point the genre of the Victorian adventure novel, for instance, you will know that Europeans, and so think along the lines of Robinson Crusoe or Treasure Island or 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea or something like that, you'll know that there was an appetite in popular culture for adventure stories, and some of these were set in Africa, and Africa offered great possibilities for these thoughts about exploration and adventure. Africa also seemed to present possibilities for scientific and geographic inquiry, and this is Europe is here coming out of the Enlightenment era, where it was believed that the whole world could be studied and understood on the principles of reason and science. And Africa, as this mysterious place, seemed to offer a tremendous amount of possibility for such inquiry, and scientists and scholars of various stripes became intrigued and began to try to study Africa in a variety of ways and from a variety of disciplinary viewpoints. Starting in the late 18th century, we also find European missionaries actively engaged in proselytizing, or at least talking about the prospects for proselytizing in Africa. And the activity of missionaries is tremendously important to this story, both because missionaries were many of the key figures, in some cases the pioneering figures to actually go into Africa, but also because the project of bringing Christianity to a dark and benighted place like Africa was very much bound up with the emerging notions of European superiority and the whole prospect of imperialism. And so missionaries were popular figures at the same time as the project of missionary work itself. The project of spreading Christianity was becoming linked in the European mind um, with European superiority and with imperialism. There really are two kind of extreme images of missionaries, though, that come out in the literature, and these are extremes. These exist on poles of a spectrum of images, I think, and so neither image is necessarily correct, but they do offer up a set of caricatures that we might work with as historians or as students of history. The first of these is the image of the uh, kind of red-faced and intransigent missionary who sees in Africa a place, intensely paternalistic figure, who sees in Africa a place of darkness and sin and really kind of Satan's playground, and sees it as his responsibility to bring Africans forcibly, if necessary, into the light of Christianity and civilization. And in the process condemns everything that is native to Africa, whether we're talking about clothing or music or dance or other cultural forms. Certainly any sort of belief that smacks of native African things would be condemned by this caricature of the missionary. The other caricature, the other image of a missionary that we tend to find in the literature is the exact opposite, or on the other end of a spectrum of images, and that is the missionary who goes native, the missionary who learns the language and even in some cases begins to dress like the native peoples he is preaching to, who criticizes the imperialism and the colonial government, and sees it as his responsibility to represent native African interests. Both figures were seen as, I think, by most people as extreme. On the one hand, I don't think that we need to, or that we can believe, or that we can conclude from reading primary sources that Europeans thought that all Africans were just these kind of impish, demonic figures who needed to be forced by the European hand to, and really are little more than slaves, needing to be dragged into civilization. I think that there is some of that, and so but that's, I don't think, largely the proper characterization of the European attitude. On the other hand, a missionary who did go native, so to speak, probably would have been condemned by the public and certainly by his fellow missionaries for giving himself over to something that was not, in their minds, proper. And we find a good deal of literature about this. One of the assigned texts, in fact, which is this one, written by Lugard. This is an interesting text. I don't want to spend too much time on it, but we can talk about it in the discussion boards. But this is really written from the viewpoint of a military man who is discussing, and this is at the very end of the 19th century, and so a lot has happened at this point, and really the colonial project, sorry for the yawn, is fully underway. But Lugard here does offer up some critique of the missionaries. He sees them, on the one hand, as absolutely vital to the cause of spreading European civilization and to the mission of Europeans. But on the other hand, he does see the missionaries as problematic, sees some of the things that they have done as being a stumbling block to the proper European mission, right? And so he says here, for instance, that an administrative mission can, of course, only be founded in a country and not under the aegis of any European power. Under such circumstances, a mission may be justified in undertaking to some extent administrative functions, pending the absorption of the country under European protection, especially where no central native authority exists and there is no cohesion to repel the attacks of slave traders or the tyranny of the dominant tribe. And so he says that missions can set themselves up as administrators of territories, especially if there's no strong local authority in place. Notice that he does acknowledge that there is a possibility that local authorities might fulfill these roles. But once the mission, or once that there are other things in place, then the missions ought to sort of resign their administrative duties. Another thing that he says here, does he say, so just to conclude that point, but when a secular administration is established, in other words, when the national government establishes a colony or a protectorate or something like that, then the missions, he says, should resign entirely into the hands of the authorized executive government, all functions pertaining to administration. So this seems to rise out of conflict between the missionaries and the representatives of the British government who have been sent specifically to administer African territory. The other thing he says here is that he warns missionaries, the essential point in dealing with Africans is to establish a respect for the European. Upon this, the prestige of the white man depends, his influence, often his very existence in Africa. If he shows by his surroundings, by his assumption of superiority, that he is far above the native, he will be respected, and his influence will be proportionate to the superiority he assumes and bears out by his higher accomplishments and mode of life. Right? And then he goes on to say, and this is where we find, some of this criticism of these European missionaries gone native. In my opinion, at any rate with reference to Africa, it is the greatest possible mistake to suppose that a European can acquire a greater influence by adopting the mode of life of the natives. In effect, it is to lower himself to their plane instead of elevating them to his. And that, I think, sums up much of the general European attitude about Africa, that it was the responsibility of Europeans to elevate the Africans to their plane, and that doing anything or respecting anything that was native African was to make a mistake. On the other hand, I don't think that they necessarily went to suggested going to extremes in their condemnation, like the other caricature of the missionary. But Lugard certainly seems to hold that the most important thing here is to establish European superiority, and through a paternalistic function, then to guide the African into civilization very slowly. And that attitude certainly informs the way that Europeans interact with Africans, not only in the 19th century, but in particular all through the colonial period, which we'll talk about later in the course. Missionaries were important kind of groundbreakers, pioneers, as I said, but over the course of the 19th century, European governments became involved to a greater and greater degree in these projects in Africa. And some of this was done under the auspices of ending the slave trade, not the transatlantic slave trade anymore, but the internal slave trade. That served as an excuse for Europeans to step up their interference in African affairs. But there were certainly other goals that they had, many of them economic, as more and more raw materials were discovered in Africa. We'll talk about the discovery of diamonds and gold, for instance, in South Africa and between the 1870s and the 1890s. Once they recognized the scope of the resources that were available, whether we're talking about palm oil in West Africa or rubber in the Congo region or gold and diamonds in South Africa, that certainly became a major part of why Europeans were involved in African affairs. Africa also, of course, presented opportunities for captive markets. If a European country administered and dominated a particular region of Africa, they could impose laws where that limited the trade in goods to only those finished products that were produced in the metropole, in the colonial power in question. And so there were a variety of reasons for the increase in European involvement, and this ultimately produces something that is known as the Scramble for Africa, where partly due to competition in Europe and partly due to the continual discovery of valuable resources, the European countries over the last couple of decades of the 19th century were anxiously involved in gobbling up pieces of Africa and holding them as their own possessions. During this whole process, and through all of these stages we've discussed, with all of these different factors involved, missionaries and abolitionists and explorers and governments, the perceptions of Africans continued to change. We find antecedents of modern racism in the 17th and 18th centuries. And some of this, we even find antecedents before this. Whether we're talking about biblical notions like the curse of Cain or the curse of Ham, biblical figures who were cursed becoming associated with Africans, that was a part of this. So some of this was theological, or scientific, or as I think we can more properly call it, pseudo-scientific notions about races that were grounded in the understanding of biology at the time. Africans came to be seen more and more as not only inferior, but perhaps even as different, inherently different on a biological level from Europeans, and that the intrinsic characteristics of Africans made them not only inferior in the moment in relation to Europeans, but could potentially make them inferior forever. That there was no chance, really, that they could ever rise to the level that the Europeans had reached. And that's the most extreme form, I think, of racism. That's something that we'll talk about more in the next lecture. But all of these developments that we will discuss in this lecture have played a role in creating these racial notions of Africa and Africans. Good, okay. Now, we also should be aware of African responses to European involvement in Africa. We often tell this story very much from the viewpoint of the Europeans because the majority of primary sources were written by Europeans, and so we get, this is partly a source bias. But we do need to account, and I think it's very important to account for the Africans. They were the majority figures in this regard. For every David Livingstone or Henry Morton Stanley or John Speke who went exploring and preaching in Africa, there were literally hundreds of thousands or millions of Africans who responded to these Europeans in one way or another. And so it's very important to gauge their reaction and their agency within this whole story, that Africans in many cases chose to interact in certain ways with Europeans because they thought it would be to their advantage. Europeans were even seen by Africans as strange and silly and ridiculous. And a lot of this had to do with the fact that Africans didn't comprehend the scope of the power of Europeans. They didn't necessarily understand that backing the one or two missionaries with whom they interacted in the African setting was a massive military armed with advanced weapons, and a government apparatus that was increasingly ready to swoop in and lay claim to these parts of Africa, nor did they comprehend, in many cases, that these European figures were informed by notions that painted Africans as inherently inferior. But that those things didn't necessarily matter to these Africans who interacted on an individual or small group level with Europeans, and so we need to comprehend this and try to understand why Africans acted the way they did as they interacted with these Europeans. Okay, so let's talk about this development of a fascination on the part of Europeans with Africa. Africa went by the nom de guerre, the kind of euphemism, the dark continent, seen as dark not only in a kind of sense of European ignorance, but also as a place that was inherently sinful and backward and potentially dangerous. During the Enlightenment period, in the 17th and late 17th and throughout the 18th century, there developed in Europe a number of learned societies. Associations, collections of scientists, literary figures, scholars of various stripes who formed institutions where they could share their ideas. They would meet, read their writing to each other, in many cases, produce journals to publish their work. And the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment took the kind of key figures of the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment in Europe often acted within those associations. So figures like Isaac Newton, or Robert Hooke, or John Locke, or Voltaire, or Leibniz, or the list could go on and on here. All acted to some extent, at least, within these learned societies. Well, these societies were devoted to a variety of learned endeavors, a variety of disciplines. There were scientific societies, for instance. There were historical societies. There were societies devoted to the study of politics. One focus of some of these societies was actually geography. And it's under the auspices of these geographic societies that we find this growing fascination with Africa, and the desire to study Africa on a more intimate level. And some of this had to do with studying indigenous cultures, simply for their own sake, to try to understand why they acted the ways they did. Part of it had to do with cartography and mapping, and there was a fascination with that. But some of the goals of these geographic societies went beyond merely scientific inquiry. Rather, they were projects, humanitarian projects, we might say. The project to abolish slavery was taken up, for instance, by these geographic societies, and they influential people in the geographic societies tried to exert pressure on parliaments or figures involved in politics to do more about the abolition of slavery. Increasingly, the geographic societies also took it upon themselves to call for and sponsor improvement among the peoples they studied. One of the earliest geographic societies was formed in Britain in 1788. It was known simply as the African Association, Africa being the main continent in which they were interested. And the members of the African Association were involved in all of these, in pursuit of all of these goals that we've discussed here. Not long after that, a couple of decades after that, in France, we find the formation of the Société de Géographie, and in Germany, the Gesellschaft für Erdkunde zu Berlin, the uh, Society for Geography. Erdkunde means geography. The Berlin Society for Geography, I guess, is the literal translation of that. And then finally, a kind of outgrowth, a society that ended up replacing the African Association, formed in 1830, the Royal Geographical Society. This is not the only royal society. There's also a Royal Historical Society and other things that were formed all around the same time. These were, again, the institutions that took up these projects. And the rhetoric that came out of these ended up influencing a number of important figures. From these geographical associations, there were scientists and writers and explorers, and in some cases missionaries, who had their start in the geographical societies, but then ended up going to Africa. And the projects that they pursued had everything to do with the way that Africa was understood and discussed in these geographic societies. And so one of the main kind of fascinations of the geographic societies were the rivers of Africa. That up to this point, Europeans had confined their involvement mostly to the coastlands, to the places where the large rivers of Africa emptied into the sea. And of course there had been a long awareness of and fascination with the Nile River, extending back into the Middle Ages and into antiquity. But the Niger, which was the coastland of which was a major center of the slave trades in the 17th and 18th centuries, and then the Congo River as well, also a major center of the slave trade. They knew about the very end of these rivers, but there was a desire on the part of these geographical societies to understand more about the river and about where it led. The idea here was, and this is part of the rhetoric, was that these rivers were really the access points from which Africa could be understood. That if one wanted to get into the heart of Africa, if you consider perhaps the classic novel that expresses this notion and the idea of Africa as a dark continent, would be Joseph Conrad's book Heart of Darkness, which we'll talk about more when we get to the book by Adam Hochschild, which is to be read for this week. King Leopold's Ghost, he talks about Conrad in there, but Heart of Darkness, right, is the title of that book, and that word heart was, not used first by Conrad. This was used all the way back into the 18th century to talk about Africa. Well, if you want to get into the heart of Africa, then you've got to go through the veins, and the rivers were the veins, right? And so there were a number of explorations that focused on the river, or on the various rivers of Africa. The desire was to navigate the river, to penetrate the interior of the dark continent, to discover what secrets lay at its heart. And by heart, that really meant to discover the headwaters, the source of the Nile, or the source of the Congo, or the source of the Niger. And in the process, these explorers would, study the indigenous peoples, try to understand what could be done in the interior to stop the systems of slave trading, and what could be done to help improve the lot of these Africans, and to bring them into Christianity and civilization and commerce. And so there are a few explorers that we could note here. As early as the 1770s, we find an Englishman, James Bruce, embarking on expeditions up the Nile. It's interestingly, and surprisingly perhaps, not until the 1850s, early 1850s, that John Speke, another Englishman, finally discovered, and I'll talk about more about the use of the word discovered in a moment here, but discovered the headwaters of the Nile. It took that long for them to figure out where it came from, and that, of course, being the northern part of Lake Victoria. The Niger River was explored as early as the 1790s by Mungo Park, another Englishman, though he did die of malaria on the way. And then a Frenchman, René Caillet, and then Richard Lander, another Englishman, in 1830. The Zambezi River by the famous missionary David Livingstone in the 1850s and 1860s, and then the Congo also by Livingstone later in his career, and eventually by the explorer and adventurer Henry Morton Stanley, who took it upon himself to be kind of Livingstone's heir. And there's a lot more that needs to be said about several of these figures that we'll read about in the Adam Hochschild book. The main thing that prevented Europeans from succeeding with these explorations, however, was malaria. And up until about 1850, expeditions sent into the interior of Africa tended to produce high death rates because Europeans were simply not accustomed to malaria. There was nothing in their immune system that would protect them from this. Expeditions might lose half of the people who embarked on it, and this contributed to the notion among Europeans that Africa was truly a cursed place, and a dangerous place, a dark place where people suffered from these unspeakable diseases. However, by about 1850, Europeans had developed a fairly effective way of countering malaria in the form of the medicine known as quinine. That can also be pronounced quinine. You might hear it said that way. Either pronunciation is acceptable. But quinine lessened the effects of the malaria, helped to prevent it, and from that point on, malaria presented much less of a threat to Europeans. But it was certainly dicey from time to time before that. Now, as the Europeans embarked on these exploratory journeys, they talked about discovering Africa. These are often heroic stories. The accounts written by some of these figures and embellished by literary figures who surrounded them were published in Europe and became bestsellers. And the fascination with Africa grew. The desire to discover Africa, to reveal all of its dark and sordid secrets, became more and more keen in the European mind. In these stories, in these descriptions of the discovery of Africa, the natives, for whom there was nothing to be discovered, of course, they had lived in this on the continent for for generation upon generation, from time out of mind. This was not anything new to them. For these Africans, this language of discovery probably would have been ridiculous, just as discovery would have been ridiculous for the native inhabitants of the Americas during the 15th and 16th centuries. But in the depictions that Europeans published and read in great demand in the 19th century about Africa, Africans are not really agents. They're not really even human. They come across as part of the landscape, that these human beings are part of what makes the continent dark and benighted and dangerous. And so there's this just caricature of Africans as simultaneously backward and ignorant and benighted, and at the same time also in some cases threatening. The malaria and attacks from natives are just part of what these European adventurers had to suffer as they embarked on these dangerous and heroic expeditions of discovery. And so that informed the way that Africa was understood. And this sort of image of Africa had a very long life. In fact, I think it still, to some extent, influences the way that we think about Africa. Even fairly recent films depict Africa very much in this way. There was a film made in the late 1990s, and I'm struggling to remember the title of it. This just came to me. I think it's called I Dreamed of Africa. But it stars, I forget, some actress who was really big in the 80s and 90s. I think it might be Kim Basinger. Sorry, I hadn't intended to talk about this in this lecture, but I think it's Kim Basinger. And it talks about Africa, and it's set entirely in Africa. This is a woman who lives in Kenya or Tanzania, probably, and she lives there with her husband and son, who are both also Europeans. And basically, Africa takes everything away from her. Her husband, sorry for the spoilers here. I'm not sure I'd recommend the movie anyway. But her husband dies at some point, having been, I don't remember, trampled by an elephant, or, I can't remember exactly how he dies. Later on, her son dies on a hunting expedition just before he's about to head off to Stanford University. And Africa takes everything away from her. And over the course of this movie, there are native African people, but they're just part of the landscape. They're not agents. They don't really act for themselves. They react in some ways to these European people who are the subject of the movie. They and I think in one case it may be Africans who kill her husband. I don't remember exactly. And so that movie was made in like 1999, and set in the modern day, and it still holds very much to this language of discovery and this caricature of Africans. Another one would be Out of Africa, which won Best Picture in 1986, starring Robert Redford. And again, the main characters in that story are white people who are the masters of Africa. And when I lived in Africa, I found this often to be the assumption that Americans and other Westerners had when they went to Africa. I remember talking to an American colleague of mine, and he said, when I first got to Africa, I expected that outside of the cities, that it would just be wild Africa, that there would be lions and elephants and other dangerous creatures running around all over the place. There'd be these native people living in huts, and he was shocked that when he got there that that people lived in Western style houses and wore Western clothing, and went to white collar jobs in many cases. And I mean, it was nothing like this depiction that he had in his mind about Africa. And so that, again, I think and this was the middle of the 1990s. That was an outgrowth of the way that Africa was talked about in Europe. So sorry for that little excursion there, but I think that we have to recognize that these images that come very much out of the 19th century are still around and still tremendously influential. Over the course of the 19th century, as we saw in the Lugard primary source that we looked at a few minutes ago, explorers and missionaries became less and less important as governments began to take over the functions that these people had fulfilled. And so, they did their job, and they contributed to the way the Europeans thought about Africa. They interested Europeans in Africa to the point where they were willing to invest millions of pounds or millions of francs or millions of marks into the colonial possession of Africa. But the explorers themselves had this kind of heyday in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, and then their job was done, so to speak. Missionaries overlap to some extent, and many of these explorers that we talked about were missionaries, were associated in some way with churches, either Protestant or Catholic. And even after the establishment of European government involvement in Africa, missionaries did continue to play a role. In fact, all the way well into the 20th century we find missionaries. There's a long history to missionary work in Africa, to Christian missionary work in Africa, going all the way back to the Middle Ages. There was a legend And this legend, it seems, was invented in the 12th century first. The legend of Prester John. This was a legend, and it probably came out of the Crusade context, that held that far to the east, beyond the lands controlled by the Muslims, again, there's the Crusade context, there was a great and powerful kingdom ruled by a Christian king. And this Christian king might not be a Catholic Christian, but he was Christian nevertheless. And it was the great desire of Europeans to establish contact with Prester John so that they could form an alliance and surround the Muslims, so to speak, force the Muslims to fight a two-front war. There were even people who turned up in Europe in the Middle Ages claiming to be from the court of Prester John. There were sources passed around which were supposedly written at the court of Prester John. Anyway, this was a legend that grew over time, and in a famous travel account written in the 15th century, similar to the Journals of Marco Polo, but attributed to an Englishman named John Mandeville. He claimed to have made it all the way to the kingdom of Prester John, and he gives these elaborate descriptions of that kingdom. Prester John appears as a character in some literature from the High and Late Middle Ages. This was around for a very long time, and the belief that there was such a kingdom persisted well into the age of the voyages of exploration. When the Portuguese began to explore Africa, they came across, eventually by the early 17th century, came across news, reports, that there was indeed a Christian kingdom in the interior of Africa. This was, of course, Ethiopia, or Abyssinia, as it was known at that point. And so when the Portuguese established contact with the Ethiopians and eventually sent people to explore that territory, they brought back very disappointing news that the kingdom of Prester John had become this benighted, ignorant place where people practice a form of Christianity, but it's so corrupt it's barely recognizable. It's a poor country inhabited by these people with dark skin, and the thought grew that there was a kingdom founded by Prester John, and who had lived for a time in Ethiopia. Prester John is invariably depicted with at least with some European features. He's never shown with dark skin, with African skin, for instance. But this kingdom founded by Prester John was then taken over and changed much for the worse by these Africans. In fact, all the way up to the early 20th century, there were still people writing about Prester John as a real figure. When Great Zimbabwe was first explored at any length by Europeans in the early 20th century, for instance, there were still Europeans who concluded and published articles about this, concluding that that Great Zimbabwe was originally the kingdom of Prester John, that he was the one who built these great walls, these great compounds, and that it had been subsequently taken over by ignorant Africans. Well, bound up in this whole narrative of Prester John and these thoughts about Prester John was the inherent notion that Africans could not do this themselves, could not produce something so great as Great Zimbabwe, could not convert to Christianity on their own, that they must have been convinced or coerced by somebody who was more like a European, and that would be Prester John. So those attitudes, again, persisted well into the modern era. Portuguese missionaries, many of them operating under the auspices of the Jesuit order in the 16th and 17th centuries, also focused very heavily on the Congo region, and even for a time formed a kingdom, or rather influenced the major kingdom who had hegemony over that area, and helped to put into place a Christian king there named Afonso in the early 16th century, who had communication with the King of Portugal and eventually even with the Pope. And now the form of Christianity that took hold in the Congo was very much different than the European form. This was something that caused these European missionaries a great deal of consternation. Afonso himself, while embracing parts of Christianity, also used it as a way of shoring up his own power and creating a cult of personality of sorts, that he was the key Christian authority and was even in some ways the heir of Jesus Christ. And so, much to the chagrin of these Europeans who were trying to convert these Africans, the Africans took parts of Christianity and, as we've seen before with Islam and to some extent with Christianity, amalgamated it with their own traditions and their own beliefs. Now, missionary work reached a high point in Africa with the Evangelical Revival in the late 18th century, and it was via these, especially Puritan missionary figures in the late 18th century, that abolition became a cause célèbre in Europe. Members of Parliament like William Wilberforce often had these evangelical leanings, were closely associated with these evangelical movements. We've talked enough about this. I don't think we need to go on at length about this. But with this evangelical interest in Africa came very much a blending of interests. On the one hand, the evangelicals insisted that the only way that Africans were going to be saved in the religious sense was to be preached to by European missionaries, and so they took that upon themselves. But at the same time, Christianity would not succeed unless other parts of African society were transformed as well. And so these evangelical missionaries were insistent that Europeans needed to give up that Africans needed to give up the slave trade and engage in legitimate commerce, and that they needed to transform their institutions, their politics, their forms of social organization. Things like polygamy, of course, came out for particular opprobrium and particular criticism. That all of that needed to be changed, and that that Christianity alone would not succeed in this. And so there was a merging of the desire to bring commerce apart from the slave trade to Africa, and also to bring European-style civilization, with the desire to bring Christianity there. And so with these three goals, the three C's, commerce, Christianity, and civilization, came the formation of missionary societies. The most important of these probably was simply called the Anglican Church Missionary Society. There was also one called the London Missionary Society, and there were a number of missionary societies, some of them Protestant, some of them Catholic, which came out of Holland and Belgium and Germany and France and Italy and other European countries. Missionary societies were the institutions who sent out the missionaries and gave them backing and funding and resources and other things that they would need to succeed in their journeys there. With the pressure of these missionary societies, European governments or Western governments backed experiments, social experiments, involving freed slaves. As some slaves were purchased by abolitionists, by missionary societies from their masters in an effort to free them, and as slaves were freed in other ways, these governments, with the sort of strategizing of the missionary societies, ended up forming communities in Africa. The earliest of these was Sierra Leone, and this is the forerunner of the modern nation of Sierra Leone. But in the 1780s, the British government, in association with the missionary societies, with the Anglican Church Missionary Society, formed a community on the western coast of Africa, which, I mean, the broader entity was known as Sierra Leone, but the main community was Freetown, which grew into the capital of Sierra Leone. And you can see a depiction of this down here on the bottom image of the slide. This is a depiction of Freetown in the 19th century. This was a place where freed slaves were to be sent, they were to be educated, they were to be taught European ways of living and thinking and working, taught, European-style trades, live in European-style houses, wear European-style clothing. Effectively, this was a European community for these freed slaves. And similar experiments were attempted by the American government in Liberia in the 1820s. The slaves who had been freed in the United States were, with the backing and funding of the U.S. government, sent back to Africa to form this place called Liberia. That, of course, comes from the Latin word for freedom. And that ran into trouble because there were, of course, native peoples living in the area, and these freed slaves who were westernized ended up clashing in many cases with those natives and exerting a great deal of authority over them. A later experiment in the 1840s was Libreville with the backing of the French government for freed slaves from the New World and from other parts of Africa to go. And, I mean, there's a lot that we could say about these social experiments. For one, they were places of tremendous dislocation that, sending somebody back to Africa did not necessarily send them back to the culture to which they were accustomed originally. Somebody from the Congo, say, who ended up in Sierra Leone would have been just as disoriented living there as he would have been living in the Americas, probably. But in the European mind, all of Africa was just Africa, right? So it wasn't seen as a problem by these Europeans. And the goals were very much in keeping with this Western notion of what needed to happen in Africa. The goals of assimilating Africans into European lifestyle, offering them European education, and effectively turning them into black Englishmen or black Frenchmen. The success rate was not tremendously high. That again, this didn't always take. Not all of these freed slaves were interested in living like Europeans. Many of them simply left and went out on their own. Some of them found that to be quite dangerous because they didn't know the lay of the land. And then also these European-style communities ended up exerting authority over the native peoples who lived in these regions, often in ways that were arbitrary and persecutory. And so, this led to the creation of some great inequities in these parts of Africa. These African societies came to conflict as well with certain European national interests that were evinced by the middle of the 19th century. The Europeans became disenchanted because, these communities of freed slaves didn't always do what the Europeans wanted them to. They stood as an obstacle to the European expansion of trade and other goals that the European nations had in Africa. The African response to Christianity was, on the whole, not very positive. In some cases, people did convert. Their motives for conversion were not always probably what the Europeans wanted. The most likely Africans to convert, on the whole, were people who were inferior in their own societies, people who were outcasts. And Christianity gave them gave them an identity that allowed them to believe that they were better than their society had convinced them that they were. But the conversion of outcasts did not necessarily lead to the conversion of those who were invested in the in the societies in Africa. Many of these Africans simply saw Christianity as foolishness. The impact of Christianity was different based on location, based on type of society. It really is impossible to generalize about this when we're talking about the entire African continent. In some places, forms of Christianity were adopted, and certain beliefs in Christianity were adopted by Africans. In other cases, they were rejected almost wholesale, and only outcasts ended up joining with the Christians. A lot of this had to do with the variable impact and the kind of chilly response that Africans had to Christianity had to do with the way Africans conceived of God or gods. African societies were invariably polytheistic, and the creator God, which who was latched upon by the Europeans as the true God, and associated with the Christian God, was usually viewed by Africans as a being who was distant, who had very little to do with the day-to-day life that most people, or that all people encountered. The Creator God was far away, so to speak, not somebody who took an active interest in human life. But because Europeans presented to Africans something that appeared distant and strange, it seemed plausible to some Africans at least that the Europeans represented the Creator God, that the God who was preached to them was indeed somebody who they should pay attention to. And so the shifting notions of gods in Africa had a lot to do with the spread of Christianity. Even when, on the other hand, even when Africans accepted the Creator God, even when they were baptized as Christians and came to accept that there was this being called God, again associated with the Creator God, they still tended to practice on a practical level, to practice the forms of religion to which they were accustomed, which involve things like the veneration of ancestors, the appeal to lesser beings. The Christian God simply became incorporated into a larger system of religious belief on the part of the Africans. Now, the influence of Islam also had a tremendous impact on the success, or rather the lack of success, that Europeans experienced in Africa. And this had a lot to do with the way that Islam interacted with African religion as opposed to the way that Christianity tended to interact with African religion. On the whole, Islam was far more tolerant of indigenous styles of belief and practice than Christianity was. And some of this had to do with the fact that Islam had been, in many parts of Africa, a presence in people's lives for a millennium at this point. And so it had, sort of settled down over the centuries and become just a part of the landscape. Christianity was, with the exception of Ethiopia, something very new to Africa. And so Christians Muslims had no problem with polygamy. Polygamy is allowed in Islam. Other cultural expressions like dancing and singing and other things had not been condemned by Muslims. On the whole, even the lack of monogamy, what Europeans tended to call sexual promiscuity, which was one of the main parts of the caricature of the African, that he or she was sexually voracious and sexually very promiscuous. That wasn't necessarily condemned by Islam, at least in its local form. Christianity condemned all of those things categorically. Even what we might find as fairly innocuous things like the clothing or the dance or the music or other cultural expressions were seen as coming from the devil by these European missionaries. And polygamy in particular was seen as absolutely abhorrent and something that needed to be forcibly ejected from any kind of Christian society. So Africans practice what we might call selective conversion, converting for their own reasons and on their own terms. And there were benefits to converting to Christianity. Christianity offered, just as Islam had done in parts of Africa, literacy, access to commerce. Missionaries were often representatives of, or they were associated with the spread of commerce, in some cases even sponsored by European firms. Christian authorities, as the European presence grew in Africa, offered protection and the force of law and the backing of police and military and things like this. And so people converted to Christianity in some cases for those reasons, even if the theology or the practice of it didn't make any sense to them or wasn't particularly appealing. A major role was played by native convert missionaries, that these European missionaries would convert to a few people and then send them on missions, in some cases take them back to Europe, educate them, and ordain them to position of minister or priest or whatever, and then send them back to Africa. And there are examples of these native African missionaries who had these long careers of going into the interior and preaching. These people were often very dislocated from African society and were seen by their fellow Africans as sellouts in some cases. Often, if they came from one group who spoke one dialect of a language, and then they were sent to a neighboring group, the language differences would be so great that they often came across as foolish because they couldn't speak the regional dialect very well. And anyway, there are a lot of stories about these native convert missionaries which show why Christianity wasn't necessarily well received, even when it was preached by native Africans to other Africans. Missionary stories were, as I said earlier, bestsellers. Particularly, one of the great icons of the Victorian era was David Livingstone. And the image you see on the slide here is from a book about David Livingstone, published in the 19th century. Here you have Livingstone standing on the back of a European-style card, but very much in a kind of rural African situation, preaching from the Bible. Livingstone spent 30-plus years of his life in Africa, partly doing scientific explorations, but partly preaching Christianity. He was the first European to explore many parts of the Zambezi River Valley, and then later on up into the Congo region. He did send letters and other reports back to Europe from time to time, but he often went years without any contact with Europeans, and so there were these kind of reports in newspapers whenever Livingstone would make contact. This was front page news back in England. Livingstone died in 1873 and was seen by people back in Europe as a martyr. He wasn't killed, he wasn't murdered, but he was seen as a martyr of Africa, that he died for the cause of bringing Christianity, commerce, and civilization to this dark, benighted, ignorant corner of the world. A lot of this had to do with the way that what happened after his death. Two of his African servants buried his heart in Africa, around Lake Tanganyika, but then carried his body all the way out of the continent to the coast, put it on a boat, took it all the way back to London, where he was buried in Westminster Cathedral. And these two Africans were seen as heroes for having brought Livingstone back, and all sorts of depictions were made of Livingstone. I mean, he was a great and heroic figure, really a larger-than-life figure in Europe at the time, and others reading the accounts of Livingstone ended up desiring to go to Africa as missionaries as well. This aided recruiting efforts. Stories like this were very popular, and lots of people, after reading them, expressed a desire to do the sorts of things that Livingstone had done. In some cases, there was conflict between Protestants and Catholics in Africa. There's a Mutesa, the Kabaka of Buganda, for instance, in the 1870s and 1880s, expressed an interest in Christianity, even though he also nominally converted to Islam, and he invited missionaries from different denominations into his court. There was a Scottish missionary named Alexander Mackay, for instance, who ended up in the court of Mutesa for several years and tried to convince him of the truth of Protestant Christianity, but much to Mackay's horror, Mutesa also invited in some French Catholic missionaries and ended up observing as Mackay and the French Catholics ended up in a huge debate, nearly to the point of fisticuffs, over which version of Christianity was proper. And you can see again why Africans would often see these missionaries as ridiculous. Observing that, one could probably not conclude anything else. Now, the whole missionary project was very important to the story of imperialism and colonialism. But in the second half of the 19th century, we witness a number of transitions. First of all, Europeans became more and more comfortable with the notion that their role in the world was to dominate, was to rule, and was to bring others into civilization. That became simply the standard public understanding of what Europe was supposed to do. Moreover, now, a lot of this had to do with the way that Europeans thought about Christianity as in their minds, this was the only true religion. It was something that needed to be taken to everybody. This was the mandate that Jesus had given to his followers, after all. So Christianity influenced the way that Europeans thought about this in ways that were probably more humanitarian. But on the other hand, there was also a limit to that. The idea that European Christians needed to accept others on their terms really was not part of the European mindset. That there was also a notion of superiority and dominance that went along with this, that was tempered slightly by the Christian conscience, but was not entirely undone by it. And Christianity became, bound up with this notion of European superiority. And some of this had to do with the fact that much of this was occurring during a time when there were a number of severe challenges made to the Christian worldview. In particular, the publication of Darwin's On the Origin of Species in the 1860s, which suggested that the European narrative of creation was not valid, that that's not how things happened. And so, to reassert the Christian worldview, Christians became more comfortable with this domination idea, the right of Europeans to dominate. And so missionaries came over the course of the second half of the 19th century to be essentially harbingers and emissaries of the growing tide of imperialism. And missionaries even offered justifications for imperialism and, even interacting with Africans in ways that prepared them to receive the full brunt of imperialism, or attempted to prepare them for that. Now, there were at the same time, and this is to come full circle and return to a point we made right at the beginning, there were doubts expressed by many Europeans that any of this was going to have an effect, that any of this was going to succeed. The idea that Africans simply could never attain to civilization or to a proper practice of Christianity was entertained by a lot of people. And as scientific or pseudoscientific ideas about race emerged, those doubts seemed to be confirmed by them. So we'll have more to say about that next time in the next class, or in the next lecture, I should say. Okay, that's the end of this lecture. I will see you in the discussion boards and in the next lecture. Thank you.